Masu. This is Catherine M. Montebon, and today I'm going to introduce to you to the 5 facts of the Japanese occupation here in the Philippines. Japanese period in the Philippines. The beginning. The Japanese occupation of the Philippines has been considered to be one of the darkest events in all of the Philippine history. It all started in the invasion of the islands on December 8, 1941, when Japanese planes from Taiwan raided America's strategic bases in Iba and Clark airfields. This happened just 10 hours after the bombing of Pearl Harbor. The Japanese Air Force continued bombing other locations in the Philippines until they almost annihilated the American air power in the country. Soon, the Japanese forces were able to land and march on the northern area of the Philippines, eventually reaching as far as Atimonan and Mauban in Quezon Province on December 24, 1941. The capital, Manila, effortlessly fell into Japanese hands as it was declared as an open city by General Douglas MacArthur to save it from utter destruction. Bataan and Corregidor. Without any aerial support to back them up, the defending forces of combined Filipinos and Americans were forced to retreat to the Bataan Peninsula. The defenders planned to make Bataan the base of operations for the resistance, hoping for the arrival of American reinforcement that never came. Still, the forces of Bataan managed to hold their ground in spite of simultaneous attack from the Japanese planes and artillery. Another base for the Philippine resistance against the Japanese is the fortress island of Corregidor. Bataan and Corregidor remained the last lines of defense in Southeast Asia for weeks, until hunger and disease prompted the commanders of the 2 outposts to surrender to the Japanese. Though ended in a crushing defeat, the defense of Bataan and Corregidor delayed the Japanese plans to invade Australia, which became the center of operations for the Allies in Pacific. The Japanese captured over 76,000 POWs in Bataan, forcing them to march in a distance of about 100 kilometers starting from Maraviles to Capas in Tarlac. Many of the prisoners were beaten on the way and weakened by either hunger or exhaustion after long hours of walking in the searing heat of the sun. Many died in this ordeal, and this Japanese atrocity became known as the Bataan Death March. Life during the Japanese occupation. Through the introduction of a currency known as the Mickey Mouse money, the Japanese seized control of the Philippine economy. There is an alarming proportion of inflation, and all the cost of food, medicines, and other important necessities started to rise. This resulted in hunger and further spread of disease such as malaria, dysentery, and tuberculosis. Filipinos live with a constant feeling of fear towards the Japanese. Forgetting to bow after a Japanese officer can sometimes result in a slap in the face. The Kempai Tai, or the Japanese secret police, hired some Filipinos to report if anybody is a member or sympathizer of the guerrilla resistance. The secret police will then capture those persons regardless of whether they're innocent or not. They simply disappeared without any trace at all. Filipino resistance. Despite the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, the resistance against Japanese rule endured. Several surviving Filipino and American officers who refused to surrender to the Japanese resorted to unconventional guerrilla warfare. One of the most notable guerrilla movements during that time is the Hukbalahap, or Hukbo ng Bayan laban sa Hapon. But because of their conflicting ideologies with the Americans, the communist guerrillas did not receive much support from the Allies. The others, however, continued to establish effective communication with the Americans by reporting intelligence about Japanese movements in the country. Originally limited to espionage, the guerrillas eventually focused on sabotaging the enemy by doing surprise raids and capturing some Japanese soldiers, as seen in this picture. In return, the Americans supplied the guerrillas with arms and ammunition, together with medical and food supplies. The return of MacArthur. Prior to the fall of Bataan and Corregidor, General Douglas MacArthur heeded the order of U.S. President Roosevelt to leave the Philippines and command the American forces in Southwest Pacific. MacArthur then pledged to the Filipinos via radio the famous line, "I shall return." He finally fulfilled his promise when his forces landed in Leyte on October 20, 1944. He walked the shores of Leyte with President Sergio Osmeña. The arriving Americans were fresh from winning the Battle of Midway, which gave them the upper hand of the war against the Japanese. Osmeña declared the restoration of the Commonwealth government with Tacloban as a temporary capital. The American and Filipino forces, with the assistance of local guerrillas, started to liberate specific locations held by the Japanese. Mindoro, Palawan, and Negros slowly fell back into the hands of the Americans. Manila was cleared out of the Japanese on March 3, 1945, but with a high price. The city was completely devastated, with 100,000 civilians dead, making Manila the second most damaged city in the World War II, next only to Warsaw and Poland. The liberation forces were able to continuously drive out the Japanese, forcing them to retreat to northern Luzon, destroying everything they find on their way. The Philippines were finally declared fully liberated on the 4th of July 1945, ending the 3 years' worth of the Japanese rule to the country.